Okay, we're going to do one more of these comparisons. I'm going to compare 3 different shows from one drum course in Santa Clara Vanguard today. We're looking at 1989, 1999, and 2018 to compare and contrast what's going on. I'm going to talk in pretty general terms. I have made a lot of specific comments about time periods and what music looked like and what made things accessible or particularly difficult in the other videos, and I don't want to repeat myself over and over again. So go watch the other comparison videos that I've done for that. I'm going to talk in more general terms now and try to hit on some aesthetic issues a little bit more and kind of share my perspectives on why I think people feel the way they do about certain things. I did solicit some concerns. One of the topics of discussion that someone mentioned that they wanted to know about was what would I say about the volume of drill, the difficulty of the drill, and the speed of the drill, and maybe what even accounts for drill these days in the recent years versus the kind of the 20, 30-year-old perspective of that. Is dancing and floating and scatter, is that drill or not? What is the story with that? So I'll be making some comparisons about that and talking a little bit about it. I will note very quickly, and I'll talk more about this later on, I'm sure, as we get into the shows, but I would say that I think addressing the issue of volume of drill is not a worthy enterprise because it doesn't really address difficulty. You can do something 10 times or you can do it once. And except for certain cases of, proficiency, like if I'm going to shoot 3-pointers in a basketball game, obviously I'm more proficient if I can do that 10 times in a row than if I'm able to get it one time, right? This is not like that. Everything that they're doing, when I use the word accessible, this is a very important point. When I say accessible, I'm not talking about easy. I'm talking about what they are expected to do. Something that is accessible is something that meets the expectation. They obviously can do this. This is within the realm of expectation. It doesn't mean it's easy. Okay, so when I say that a piece of music, a portion of music is accessibly written and the drill is accessible, I'm saying that it's in a normal plane of expectation. They are expected to be able to do this. It doesn't push the limits really in any way. Okay, so when I'm talking about the ostinato playing in Star 1991, and those rips that seem very difficult, when I say that it's accessible, I'm saying it's not very difficult to play. It's actually within expectations for them to play that and move and march drill. And it has to do with the way those parts are written, the fact that they're repeated, and the difficulty in the fingerings, which it sounds more difficult than it really is. Okay, so when you're talking about volume of drill, you're dealing with the same thing. It is not more difficult for a group to perform a particular drill move more than one time. It's as difficult to do it 5 times as it is to do it one time. When they're doing it 5 times, you're dealing with aesthetics, not difficulty. Okay, so that's why I don't think it's a worthy enterprise to do the stopwatch thing and account for how much they're marching drill. And we're actually going to see a great example of this when we get to 1999. When we look at the 1999 show, that argument that I'm making is going to make sense because they do something more than one time, and they don't do it because it's more difficult. They do it because it's cool. They do it because it's interesting. They do it because it's addressing an aesthetic point that satisfies the audience. We can say the same thing about company fronts, which we're going to talk about in the 1989 show. There's a point in that show where the audience is aroused by what they see, and it's not because it's difficult. It's because it matches the vocabulary of the drum corps fan. It satisfies that vocabulary, and it piques their interest. It is aesthetically pleasing. Okay, so volume of drill, it's a non-issue. It just isn't. And oftentimes that gets pulled into the argument about what makes something difficult. Well, they're not marching as much. That makes it easier. It does not make it easier. It's got nothing to do with difficulty and proficiency. I can see why it's a pseudo-logical conclusion to conclude that, but it is pseudo-logical. It's not really logical. Okay. Difficulty of drill, we will talk about that as we have been. Some drill moves are more difficult than others. Step size makes something difficult. Velocity makes it difficult. Tempo makes it difficult. The amount of dress points makes it difficult. However, you'll note that when drill gets really difficult in any time period, as I've been noting all along, the music decreases significantly for the people performing that drill. That's always and forever how it has been done. It's done that way today, and it was done that way back in the 80s. So difficulty of drill apart from the music is not much of a conversation to have. What we're looking at is what's happening in the music and the drill. It is within the expectation that a drum and bugle corps that has rehearsed can do difficult drill without playing. Okay, so we won't talk much about that. We'll note more about what's going on in the playing and the drill at the same time. Speed, again, I've already addressed that as difficult in the talk about difficulty of drill. Other things that people brought up, let me see here, I did write a few things down about how long horn lines are playing versus yesterday and today. How much are they playing then? How much are they playing now? This is again an issue with the same issue with drill. It doesn't really matter how long they're playing. What that speaks to again is the aesthetic. It's not about the difficulty. A horn line can play a long period of time out of 10 minutes in 1989 and play a very short period of time in 2018, and it doesn't really address the difficulty of the music at all. Any player knows, and I may bring this up later, any player knows, someone who's marched drum corps, you know that you're winded after the first minute of the opener. And you're not more winded after 10 minutes. You're not more winded after 12 minutes, right? You're as winded at that point as you were in the first minute. You are sustaining that. Physical requirement throughout. It doesn't make it more difficult. Now, you do get to a point of fatigue after a long period of time, but you don't really feel all that different at the end as you do after the opener. You feel the same way. So the amount of playing doesn't speak to difficulty, it speaks to aesthetics. The ensemble in the contemporary age is much more inclusive, whereas the ensemble was more exclusive back in the 80s. It was more about the brass band, and then you had some other different kinds of additional instrumentation adding color. These days, the ensemble is about a much larger group. The ensemble is the front ensemble. So you can have soloists playing, and the larger group is not playing as much. And they had that back then. You'll notice in the 1989 show, there's a lot of, and I may not bring it up here, but I'll tell you now, there's a lot of small ensemble playing, a ton of it. And the larger group isn't playing during that time. So does that categorize as not playing very much? Well, I guess so, but I think it doesn't matter. That doesn't speak to difficulty, okay? So I'll address that here right now. You'll notice that as we go through it. But anyway, those are the big points that people were bringing up, and I'm giving you my honest opinions about those now before we get into these shows. So let's watch these drum corps shows together. And again, I'm not going to repeat myself a whole lot from the previous comparisons that I did. You can go back and watch those to get a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on the technicality of playing brass instruments and moving and playing with them. We're going to talk about some generalities here between these three shows and share a little bit of the historical perception at the time that fans had about the shows. So let's get into it with Santa Clara Vanguard 1989. Santa Clara Vanguard 1989. This is a high cam video of the quarterfinals performance. This is, of course, a championship win for them. The music of Phantom of the Opera. This is the second year in a row where they played the same theme, I guess we'll say. It's not exactly the same material, but the same theme. Very good opening drill move with a moderately big velocity, or a big step size and high velocity movement on the move they're playing. Again, with the thesis of this whole project here, noting that you can only play what you can play on the move, and when it's highly difficult to move and to move on what you have to play. Drill writers don't make the move. So the music, of course, was accessible. I know some people are getting irritated with my use of that word, but please understand when I say accessible, I'm not talking about easy. Accessible doesn't mean easy. It just means that it's within the realm of acceptability and expectation. That's what we're talking about. A lot of people, when they're asked what is your favorite drum corps show, if they were around or paying attention to drum corps back in this era, I would say a good chunk of them, a plurality of them, will probably name this show as their favorite one. This is another one of those, really highly revered programs. I could speculate on the reasons for that, but I wouldn't want to offend anybody by suggesting something that doesn't fit their definition. I will note one thing. A common complaint about shows today, it's a difficult drill move right there. And you can see the crowd responding to it appropriately. A common complaint today I know about contemporary shows is that the programs are made up of short phrases and the music is chopped up. You don't really hear an extended version of the source music. You hear small segments. I'll stop that thought for a second. Again, they're really moving, they're really hauling, but they're not playing. The responsibility of playing is on the front ensemble. And when it comes time to play, as it is in every era of drum corps in the design, the velocity slows down significantly. They go to a high step. Horns down, high velocity drill, they'll come back. This is what you do, and I know some of you may be getting sick of me making that point, but that is just what you need to understand. There's nothing abnormal about today's design choices in terms of staging, stopping, moving, playing. And what they're playing right now is not what I wouldn't consider to be extremely technical. Again, it's all very accessible stuff. This is pretty straightforward playing. This is in an era before, I think as one person put it recently on the internet forums, before I think designers were making choices about music difficulty just for the sake of it being difficult. There's a sense in which that's a criticism. There's also a sense in which it's probably true about today's shows. We'll see a little bit of that as we look at the other two Santa Clara Vanguard shows here. But you do know that when the music becomes complicated for a group, they will get a lower velocity drill. They're really running. This is probably the highest velocity drill of the three older programs that we've seen. Of all three, even more than the Star 91. People claim that the music in Star 91 was very, very difficult and they were really flying around. The step sizes were considerably smaller for Star 91 than this show. Now they're playing a lot of sustained stuff. The phrases are pretty straightforward. So the music isn't necessarily beyond the pale for the marching, but the marching is really, aggressive. What I was saying there is a complaint about contemporary shows is that they play small phrases and the arrangements are really chopped up. There's that scatter drill moment, right? They go to a set, and then I believe they're going to scatter from this again. So the aesthetic was there back in the day. It might not have been quite as common and so frequent, but they were doing that kind of stuff. I want you to note in this show, I know I'm talking, but you'll have to go watch the show for yourself all the way through it. This show is made up of small fragments of music. Different pieces fragmented together. You never really get the full effect of most of the music that they're playing. Why are they able to do it without much criticism? Well, I think it really just comes down to the fact that people know the music. They're okay with it because they have a more intimate understanding of what the music is. They know what's coming next, and when they shift gears and go from one piece to another one in just a 4-bar phrase, the audience has an appreciation for it rather than a criticism of it, and that has to do with the aesthetics again. This is an aesthetic thing. This is not about difficulty. Great segregation of visuals, separating the guard out for that movement. They do that a few times in here, very classic drill writing for that time period. We see a lot more integration of the guard these days, and you can kind of lose the picture. So again, another part of the criticism of today from the past is the readability of forms. Although I will say, for the assumptions that are made about contemporary shows, when we get to the 2018 show, particularly in the last act of the production, the last third, the drill is incredibly readable and very classic. And I think that's typical. I think that's a typical demonstration of the amount of classic drill that's being marched in shows today. It just gets lost in the arguments. I think people don't really think about it fairly. Fast, big picture drill in this show. The music facilitates that, and I think that's an honest thing to account for when recalling this show. Horns at carriage, for this is a percussion feature. Typical to drum corps shows. Good contrasting motion on the move, so they can keep a relatively moderate step interval and still project high velocity. That's a concept a little ahead of its time. The kind of ballad moment, which is typical to shows, you have an opener, you have sort of an introductory music, and then an opener, and then you'll eventually have a ballad moment, at the 2/3 mark in the show, and then you have a kind of a closer. This is the ballad moment, and this is the one place in the show where we actually get a lengthy statement of a single piece of music. The rest of the program is actually incredibly fragmented. But again, the nature of the familiarity of the music makes the audience, I think, accept it and not really recall this as being essentially designed just like a contemporary show. It's the same musical design. I think, I wanted to address this, and I might as well start on this one. One of the issues that was brought up was an accounting of time. How much do they play before stopping, and how much do they play on the move? Let me talk about this drill moment in a second here. We'll come back to that. Look, watch this. Watch the crowd. We're able to see the crowd in this video. And they go bananas. They get a standing ovation on this company front. This is really important to note about drum and bugle corps. There's nothing really difficult. This is not about difficulty. That's not why they're standing. They're not standing because they did something proficient or difficult. Although some people might say that a company front on the move is difficult. It's not any more difficult than other things they've been doing. It's a phenomenology, right? It's a study in phenomenon. There's a phenomenon to that. It's a piece of vocabulary that warrants a response from the audience. And that's why they do it. And you'll note that throughout the other shows that we have. There is certain vocabulary. Stop this here. There's certain vocabulary that warrants a response. It's an aesthetic thing, though. Doesn't have anything to do with proficiency or difficulty. That's what that's what designers are trying to address, first and foremost. They're trying to address the aesthetics of something. And if you have a difference of opinion on the aesthetics, a particular show may not speak to you. But just be aware that that's an issue of aesthetics. It's not about the difficulty. I think it's very easy to project, again, with this thesis, I think it's very easy to project difficulty and proficiency as being the cause for your concern, when really it's an issue of disinterest. It's not even an issue of boredom. It's an issue of disinterest. Shows can be really wild and off the wall and busy, and you're not necessarily bored with it. I know some people use that term. Really, you're disinterested. You lack an interest in what's going on, and reasons for that being is that it's not addressing your expectations for aesthetics. The difficulty might be through the roof. The proficiency might be through the roof. But if they're not addressing your expectations, then you're going to have an issue with the show. And that's fine. There's again, nothing wrong with that. I think design teams shed a tear when they are writing shows that are missing expectations of fans. They don't like to do that. They're trying to be innovative and trying to make shows that do address the fan base in the stands and affect them in a meaningful way. And they don't want people to not have interest in their show. That doesn't mean that they're going to get it right, though, every time. Or that they're not going to sacrifice some fans for their goal. Not a lot to say about the show. It is what it is. Everybody knows it. It certainly has a high standard of writing in terms of the velocity of the drill. But as you can see, as I pointed out in various places, and this is high cam, so I can't really, I couldn't really detail. I think it's more important to see this high cam. Most of the shows that we remember from the TV multi-cam presentations, which doesn't really see the whole picture. And I think it's nice to be able to see the whole thing and appreciate the drill a little bit better in this way. But there, you would note, if you were looking closely, over and over and over and over, the application of higher velocity drill when the music warrants that to happen cleanly, and lower velocity drill when the music does not warrant that to happen. When there's a drum feature, the winds haul, across the field. When there's a solo, there's a lot of hand movement and body movement. That's just how drum corps shows work. It's how they worked in 1989, and it's no different than today. There is a difference, again, as I pointed out in some of the other older classic shows. There is a notable, honest difference in the difficulty of the music at certain places. You'll note in the more recent shows, and even when we get to 1999 here, just 10 years later, there is a higher demand in the music on particular parts. Not all the time, but on particular parts. They didn't showcase that kind of stuff back in the day. That's not what the goal was. It wasn't to park the winds and have them play a very intricate, difficult line. They didn't do that kind of stuff. Now there's wind band music that that has that, as we're going to see, and I don't think when you see that you should automatically assume that the music is written just for the sake of being difficult. I mean, it is a competitive thing. It's a competitive activity, so they are keeping that consideration. But some of the music, the contemporary type music that they're using for some of these shows, it has that stuff written in. And if you want to play it, you have to consider what you're able to do on the move. Okay. So we'll talk more about this as we get into the next one. So that is 1989. Very high quality show for that time period. You can see a difference, I think, in the quality, the talent from that time to now, just by the music, what they're able to get, what they write for them, and what they're able to get away with, and the way forms work. There, it's rough around the edges. I think we have a very glossy view of some of these old shows, but they're as rough back then as they are today. There's stuff in there that just isn't perfect. And maybe in that respect, that's what makes it perfect. You know that they're human when they're doing it. Okay, so hopefully I said enough on this show to move on. Again, I'm not repeating everything that I've said in all the others. People are getting sick of it. This is probably the last one of these that I'm going to do, because you can only do this so much and say the same thing. Let's take a look at 1999. We'll recall some of this stuff in 1989 a little bit as we look at 99 and make some comparisons. Again, we're looking for similarity. We're looking for what is it about drum corps design on the difficulty level that is really universal and timeless. The choices that are made. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences of aesthetics, and I will posit some ideas that I have for why people feel certain ways about things without really coming down hard on a particular side. Santa Clara Vanguard, 1999. I wasn't going to give you a lot of my personal feelings on this, but this is actually one of my very favorite shows ever. I really, really enjoyed this one when they marched it. It's kind of a darker tone, not thematically, because it doesn't really have a theatrical sort of theme like a lot of shows did back in the 80s and early 90s, and like a lot of shows do now. This was really kind of Santa Clara Vanguard went through a time period there where they were doing shows that were really for the brain. They were I don't know what you would say. They were kind of concrete music sorts of productions. Absolute art. It was art for the sake of it, itself. So 20th century compositions. Playing on the move. Again, accessible music. Normal. It's just normal stuff that you would play on the move. Not easy, just normal. It's what you would do. Until we get here. And you know what I'm going to say about this. For these sopranos and mellophones, this is beyond accessible for movement. And that's why they get parked there. And as you get into the later shows, the most recent, iterations of drum corps, they're doing more of that stuff at even more complex level, just heavier writing. And one person commented about they wanted to see or hear more about comparisons in the amount of time that the winds are playing versus the amount of time that they're not in different shows. They want comparison show to show, era to era. And I think that's a fool's errand to try to do that. I said I would address it, and this is how I'm addressing it. It's really a waste of time to do the stopwatch stuff, in my opinion, because it doesn't prove a thing. Think of it like this. If you heard me playing a complicated passage in a piece of music that I was working on, some 20th century piece, real quick about bugles. 2 years from this date, I believe, Santa Clara Vanguard would be playing on B flats. This is a G soprano, minor third lower than the B flats. And you can see he's playing in the solo up to written high C, A flat. You see the third valve show up in there. That fingering for the A flat would be fingered 1 on the 2 valve instruments, and that's really the only fingering that would need an alternate in the general range of the instrument. So adding the third valve didn't do a lot more for drum corps. It did make that fingering more in tune, and a couple of other lower fingerings that were kind of out of the typical range accessible and available, I should say, not accessible but available. Back on the no movement, not for any particular reason, but again, they did stand still, in this era. I remember the complaints in the late 90s about how shows were being written where they're just standing around. So this, and how they're doing body movement and not marching. Why aren't they marching drill? I want to see drill, and they're doing body movement. These complaints are not new. They've been around a long time, and it's about aesthetic perception, I think, more than anything. Percussion feature, classic kind of staging for that. That point about how much they're playing. It's kind of like if you were to catch me rehearsing a complicated 20th century piece of music, and visual aesthetics there on the right. It's hand movements rather than drill. It's just a different thing, different way to achieve visual impact. Remember the company front thing and how they went bananas, right? It's not hard, it's just part of the vocabulary. This is becoming part of the vocabulary. It's things that people are responding to. So I'm trying to get the story out and still comment on this. Imagine that I'm practicing a complicated 20th century piece of music on my trumpet, on a trumpet player, and I'm playing the hardest passage over and over again. You hear me play it 10 times. Okay? And this is going to play into my analogy right here. Cool drill move. It's difficult. It's a box rotation, and it's got to be dressed, lots of points of dress in there. They're going to do that exact same visual again later in the show. Now, it's probably not dot for dot the same thing with members in the same place. That doesn't matter. They don't do it twice because it's more difficult having done it twice. They do it twice because it's cool. It's not more difficult for them to do it twice. It's just as hard the second time as it was the first time. That there's no reason to do more of it other than the fact that it has an aesthetic appeal. To do it. So if you hear me, same thing, if you hear me playing a hard passage from a piece of music in the practice room or in the studio, and I do it 10 times over, by that logic, it must be more impressive to hear me practice than it is to hear me play it one time in performance. And that doesn't make a lick of sense, really. It's actually probably more impressive to hear it one time in performance because it's in context. Quantity doesn't mean much. Again, a performer knows, anyone who's done this knows that you're winded by the end of the opener. You're winded by the 5th set of the opener. Once you start hauling around and having to monitor your breathing, you don't get more winded by the 10 minutes of performance. You just sustain that all the way to the end. So quantity is not difficulty. That's not how you determine it. It's a pseudo-logical conclusion to assume that. I can see why people go there, but that's not how it works. So counting up the minutes of playing and not playing, that's not really telling you anything about what makes a show hard or what makes it easy. What it tells you is it tells you about the mechanics of the ensemble and how it has changed over time. Ensembles these days, as I mentioned on the first review, are different than they were 20, 30 years ago. They're more inclusive. As we see in every show, everything slows down for the ballad, and there's a lot of standing still. When we watch new shows in the second decade of the 2000s, and we see groups being put on staging or props or something standing still for the ballad, that's no different than what we're seeing here. Just remember that. It's a different aesthetic, but it's technically, proficiently no different. We're seeing the scatter drill thing, setting one form and going to another. That has an aesthetic. I think the piece is called Blue Shades. I can't remember. I remember that I think 2 corps played that this year. I think the Crossmen may have played it as well. Frank DeKelly. It's a Frank DeKelly piece. I remember studying the piece in college for conducting, and I recall it had some more complex meters than what they're, as you look at the drum major, I think they rearranged this, simplified it into some more accessible meters, again, to make it idiomatic for drum corps. And that's something that they do in the arranging often. I can't remember if this is an Adam Gord piece. It may not be. It's a Frank DeKelly piece. Great piece with a lot of color. There's not a lot going on at any one time until you get to the big shout section. And that in itself makes them able to do some higher velocity drill here. There's a lot of movement. Tempo is another thing I know someone brought up, is comparison of tempos. Tempos really only matter when the requirement for playing is increased. Obviously. There's no difference between, I think, marching a fast tempo on a moderate step size and having to run to a location, climb the equivalent of a 15-foot ladder and then play. That's the same thing, technically. Here's that move again, and they do it. I always thought this kind of looked like a big fly swatter, They do the move not because it makes the show more difficult. They do the move twice because it makes the show cool. It's just a good visual, and the crowd loves it to see it again. So we'll stop right there. That's 1999. To very quickly draw some comparisons to 89. The drill is not so far different now in the second decade of the 2000s, where we look at those two productions and think that they're very different from each other. But back in that decade, back in 1999, the perception was among fans that this is just totally different from what we used to see in the good old days. Things have changed drastically, and there was a lot of the same talk about how they wanted things to be more cohesive, and they wanted thematic shows that you could follow and you could listen to without so much pausing and breaking. There was a big gripe at this time in the late 90s, early 2000s about music sounding too 20th century. Just not being able to understand it without some sort of explanation provided in the program notes, and that was what people were complaining about back then. And it's hard to conceive of that now because it seems like there's a whole bunch of other problems that people really, have with the aesthetics of shows. So hopefully I said enough on that one to give you a little bit of a comparison. Really the biggest difference between this and the other one is the music, the type, the musical choice that's going on in there, and a little bit of the complexity in the music. So let's take a look at Santa Clara Vanguard 2018. So this is a big jump ahead. This is a 20-year jump, a 19-year jump into the future. We're skipping over 2009 and jumping forward to 2018 and make a little bit of a comparison between these three shows. Okay, Santa Clara Vanguard 2018. This is a little more in the moment. This is just a year removed, and this is a championship show and a fairly highly revered show. People really like this one. I enjoyed it. Criticisms at this time is that they're not marching as much, I suppose. I think in 2019, the year we're in, people really seem to be dogging Santa Clara Vanguard about not marching drill. And again, that's a discussion to have, is what is marching drill? Well, you can conceive of marching drill as being what it really is, drill as we know it or have known it. And if that's your criticism, then yes, they're not marching drill, like we remember it from 1989 and 1999. This is going to be very different. However, I do want to note that when we get to the last third of this show, when we get to the very end, we're going to see a lot of drill, and it's going to be drill as we know drill, and it's going to be pretty good drill too. It's a pretty high standard of writing and execution when we finally get there. And again, how much do you need to see to know that it's good? How much do you need to see to know that it's difficult? How much do you need to see to know that they are maxing out their proficiency on something worthy? Only you can answer that as a fan. For me, I don't need to see a lot to be satisfied and know that we're hitting all the marks in terms of difficulty. A lot of body movement. That's the day and age. That's the visual aesthetic. Big hit. Now, these aren't, actually that is a pretty good readable form there, but forms these days are much more compartmentalized that we've talked about in the other videos. And again, if you have an issue with that, know that it's an aesthetic issue, it's not a difficulty issue. Compartmentalizing drill doesn't make it easier. That's not, something that you can really logically conclude. But you can see there's a form, over here, there's a form here, and then there's a form over here. Drill is drill. It's still the same as what we're seeing in the other shows. With the difference being that they're adding body movement. Sometimes that's related to the difficulty of the music at the moment, but not necessarily. Right there we had some fairly accessible licks going on, nothing really terribly complicated. They were going for a visual aesthetic with the body movement. Now here's a question for you. Is it easier to do what you just saw there with the foot and arm movement, between beats or whatever, or on short phrases, or is it easier to march at a moderate step size, moderate tempo? I think you're really dogging for your preferences when you try to have that argument, because I don't think it's really different in terms of difficulty. It's the same thing. Again, playing moderate music on a high velocity drill move isn't a lot different from playing hard music on pretty classic drill there. Very Gainesian kind of drill, Michael Gaines. Obviously what this performer is doing here is individually difficult, and they're going after a visual aesthetic with that. but it's not necessarily hard for the group to watch the guy flip down the field. So we've seen some iterations of drill. Drill as we know drill. It's interrupted with body movement and foot movement and stuff like that. That doesn't make it easier though. I think it's improper to presume that and assert it. I'll tell you what, it's improper to presume it and assert it unless you've done this drill or something like it in this era. And you can say that you know from doing it, it was easier to accomplish than marching classic drill. I think it would really require that kind of experiential analysis. Very difficult chromatic passages, and that's not typical of 20 years before, except for, one or two moments in a show where you would get that in that era. And they would park the horns that were playing it for that moment, as we saw in 1999. And they didn't do anything like that in the 80s. They just didn't play music that way. That wasn't part of the repertoire. They were doing different things. I will say, I think you come close to it if you look back at Madison Scouts the year prior, 1988, had some moderately difficult licks going on in there that they were playing on in classic drill, although you'll note that they parked and played a lot of that in that show, and it wasn't quite as difficult as what we're hearing here. They just didn't program music that way. They had a different priority in arranging. It's not that they couldn't do it, it's just that they didn't choose to. One of you mentioned that you wanted to hear me speak to the aesthetics a bit more, and I already have. I just don't know that you've noticed it. If you don't like this aesthetic, you may actually be concluding that you don't want to hear so much technical playing, and that's a valid complaint, right? You can say, I want to see more classic drill, and if it means less technical playing, then so be it. Then I want less technical playing. I would prefer that. But just note that the two desires are not compatible, to have high velocity drill and technical playing. They don't mesh. They don't work together. Compartmentalized formation, again, you got something going on over here, percussion down here and some other things, using these platform props. Different visual aesthetic. And the critic would look at this and say, I can't read this. This is just scattering, getting to the next point, the next set, rather than appreciating what drill can look like on the move. And that is true. That is a valid complaint, if it weren't for the fact that that is not a concern of the designers. They have bigger fish to fry. They're after something else. They're not after classic drill at this moment. They're doing a different visual aesthetic. So another question, is it easier to march and play? You see these little pop-up moments of classic drill, and it expands out and gets bigger and bigger until you get a large formation. I really like that. That's a neat effect. By today's standards, it's a neat effect. The question is it more difficult or less difficult to do the scattering formation while playing versus the classic drill while playing? Accessible music, right? We're not assuming that they're playing hard music. Is one more difficult than the other? The faulty logical conclusion would be that it's easier to perform the scatter drill while playing than the normal formation drill, the standard stuff. And the reason why you conclude that is because, well, it's an unreadable form, so who knows if they're making a quote-unquote mistake. But that's just not, that's a faulty reasoning, because you should assume, you really ought to assume that that's not the concern. If there's no readable form there, then that's not part of the obligation. The obligation is getting to the location via the proper path. I know this seems like I'm talking in circles, but I'm just rationalizing. I'm rationalizing the cause and effect of these design choices. It's not easier to play on the move in a scatter effect than it is to maintain drill. You have a responsibility in both, and the goal is to meet it. So the aesthetic criticism is that this is disinteresting, right? If it doesn't meet the expectations of the audience member, which might be a more classic drill or whatever the case may be, this becomes disinteresting. This does not look like what I want my drum corps to be. Therefore, I am disinterested. And that's fine. You know, that's the way it goes. Some Gainesian drill here again. High velocity, contrasting motion. It more so projects high velocity because of the contrasting motion. We talked about that in the first show. Compartmentalized rotations, difficult stuff to do. But this is, this is drill. This is classic drill. Even with the use of the props, that disintegration effect, it's kind of reminiscent of the Garfield thing, but it's an updated rendition of it, right? Now think about this. Some of these kids just went up essentially 2 flights of stairs when they're playing, so that's not easy. You can't really say that it's easier to do that than for these guys to march classic drill. All right, so just to wrap up a few things to compare across the different eras. In the aesthetic is different. They're doing visual things rather than drill as I know it. But again, the question is it more or less difficult because of that change? And I think you can really only answer that for sure if you've done it, but I think we can reason on a level of physicality that the movements that they're doing are equivalent to the difficulty of performing moderate drill. This isn't a difficulty issue. So I'm rambling on, and I'm just giving you the same story that I've given you on all the other videos. And no matter how many of these I do, and again, I think this is the last one, someone's going to say, yeah, but you didn't cover this show. Look, I'm not doing this trying to prove a point by cherry picking these shows. I'm really trying to pick the ones that seem to fit the arguments the worst, right? I'm trying to find the ones that people complain about. Think about this. I went to Star 91 because people remember that as being very hard, and in the recent forums posts, people are saying, well, Star 91 was really difficult. But after I did that, a lot of people on that the comment section there, they said, well, I wouldn't have picked Star 91. I would have picked a different one. So no matter what you do, someone's going to say that you have an agenda. I don't have an agenda. My only agenda is that we really ought to be giving these kids some slack these days, because what they're doing is, it is hard stuff. It's hard. It's harder than it's ever been. They are not getting a free pass. It has not been made easy for them. It is not easier to execute. It is not a softball pitch to stop and play some of the stuff they're playing. Running up a prop and then playing is not easier than marching moderate drill and playing. It's just not. It doesn't work that way. We need to be looking at what's going on and taking, in my opinion, taking the difficulty element out of the argument and focusing on aesthetics. This is about aesthetics. It's about how you perceive beauty and what you want to see. What are our expectations for shows? And I think it's one thing to say that the 2019 whatever drum corps is not satisfying my expectations for what a drum corps show should be. I think that's one thing. It's a whole other thing to say, it's not satisfying my expectations, therefore it's easy. They're taking the easy way out. All they're doing is they're stopping and playing. Well, what are they playing when they're stopping? Is it really hard when they're stopping? If it's really hard when they're stopping, then but of course they're stopping. They're not going to march through that. They never did before. Why would they now? That's my agenda. That's my agenda. So, if you want to know what I think about aesthetics, I've got a pretty wide view of appreciation. So I can sit and appreciate a lot of different kinds of ideas. I'm a blue coat. I love what the blue coats do. I love that the blue coats seem to really try to write shows that appeal to a large group of people. I understand the aesthetic issues that some people have with blue coats now, and the staging and the theatrical kind of sideshow imagery that they're doing, but that's the aesthetics of the time. They're competing on that expectation, right? I guess you could say they're writing shows for the judges. That's an old complaint that people have made about shows. They were making that complaint back in 1999 for sure, with that Santa Clara Vanguard show. That was a big complaint back then in that era, that drum corps designers were writing shows for judges and not caring about the audience. People were saying that back then about that show. We don't remember that, but that's what was going on. So I understand the aesthetic arguments, but those are, again, all about preference. I do not understand the difficulty arguments. I don't buy it. It doesn't play out if we're being honest about what we're looking at. I think design has been remarkably consistent over time, that difficulty is measured the same way now as it was in 1985. It's the same thing. Difficult then is difficult now. It's not any different. The same considerations are in play when deciding movement and music, and how the two go together, and when they need to be divorced from each other in shows. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this trip down memory lane and looking at these shows. This is, again, I think this is the last one I'm going to do. So even if you come up with other shows to look at, I will just say this. Look, we're going to come to the same place on any show you pick. I would invite you, here's my challenge to you. If you're going to look at a show and try to play this out in your own kind of commentary, your own inner monologue, I would invite you to watch more than one show at one time. I would look at one show from 10 or 20 years, a different era, a different time period, and then watch the one that you're focusing on and really do a real comparison. Don't just watch one isolated by itself and then come up with an argument. You really need to be honest about it. I would also invite you to learn more about what is difficult to do. It's one thing for a percussionist to look at the brass section and say what they're doing is easy, but if you don't know anything about brass playing, you can't really conclude much about it, right? I can't conclude much about percussion parts. I'm a music educator. I know it's difficult. I do. But when I'm looking at all this rudimentary playing in drum and bugle corps, I don't know who's a tenth of a point away from who. I can't really answer that. You know, I can talk in very general terms, but I can't get nitpicky about what someone is doing and what makes it easy, you know, or what makes it hard. So learn a little bit about it before you really make those big complaints. I think most of the complaints have to do with the brass section. So if you're not a brass player and you don't know, learn something about it and then formulate your opinion. You know, don't just go off making claims about what's easy and what's hard if you don't know what it is. You know, focus your arguments on something else. All right, enough rambling. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. And yeah, I look forward to the rest of the 2019 season. I can't wait to see how these shows look when they're all finished. They're not going to look the same as they do now. There's going to be a lot added to them and a lot of changes, and they all change. No one drum corps has a monopoly on changes. They all do it. So can't wait to see what it looks like at the end, and maybe next year we can look back on these shows and find some video of them and compare and contrast. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this time looking at these things. Hopefully I didn't waste your time, and hopefully you were able to tolerate my rambling, and hopefully you maybe changed your opinion a little bit about this and were able to consider some other perspectives. So yeah, have a good day, have a good drum corps season, and I'll see you maybe in one of these next season.